3 months ago, I was Lucky Moreau, bartender and owner of an underground speakeasy in New Orleans. Then an asteroid hit Earth and plunged us into an ice age apocalypse. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 30 days. The power died. People started freezing in the streets. I opened my grandmother's old smuggling tunnels to survivors, thinking I was saving lives. Instead, I invited betrayal, violence, and a war for control that nearly killed us all. This is how I survived the first 90 days when the world ended, and humanity showed its true face. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comments section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Dante Moreau, but everyone calls me Lucky. 3 months ago, I owned and operated the Crossroads, an underground speakeasy hidden beneath a coffee shop in the French Quarter of New Orleans. My grandmother built those tunnels during Prohibition, and I inherited more than just a bar when she passed. I inherited a network of smuggling passages that stretched beneath half the city, connections to every criminal organization in Louisiana, and a reputation as the one neutral ground where enemies could drink together without killing each other. December 15th, 2024 started like any other day. I remember waking up in my apartment above the coffee shop at 6 in the morning, the smell of chicory coffee drifting up from the legitimate business downstairs. The weather was typical for New Orleans in December, maybe 60 degrees and humid enough to make your shirt stick to your back. I had no idea it would be the last normal day any of us would ever see. I went through my usual morning routine, checked the hidden entrance behind the false wall, counted last night's take, and started preparing for another day of serving drinks to politicians, gang members, and desperate souls looking for a place where nobody asked questions. The Crossroads had been operating for nearly a century, and we had never been raided, never been shut down, never had any serious trouble that couldn't be solved with the right conversation and the right amount of money changing hands. My grandmother used to tell me that the key to running a successful speakeasy was reading people. She said you had to know who was dangerous, who was desperate, and who was just looking for a place to forget their problems. I had been practicing that skill for 15 years, ever since I took over the business, and I thought I was pretty good at it. I could spot a cop from across the room, identify an undercover federal agent by the way he held his drink, and tell when someone was carrying a weapon just by how they walked through the door. But on December 15th, I couldn't read the signs that were right in front of me. The news had been talking about some asteroid for weeks, but it was just background noise to me. Scientists were always predicting doom and gloom, and nothing ever came of it. Hurricane season was our real concern in New Orleans, not rocks from space. I had survived Katrina, lived through countless storms, and figured I could handle whatever nature threw at us. The morning crowd was typical for a weekday. A few city council members having their breakfast meetings, some dock workers getting off the night shift, and the usual collection of bookies, smugglers, and small-time criminals who made up my regular clientele. Everyone was talking about Christmas plans, complaining about the cold snap that had dropped temperatures into the 50s, and making jokes about the asteroid that was supposed to hit somewhere in the Atlantic. I was restocking the bar around 10 in the morning when Jimmy Tran, one of my regulars who worked at the Port of New Orleans, mentioned that shipping schedules were being disrupted. He said something about emergency protocols and government agencies asking questions about cargo manifests. I should have paid more attention to that conversation, but I was focused on inventory and making sure I had enough whiskey for the lunch rush. The lunch crowd was lighter than usual. A few of the politicians who normally held court in my back booths were missing, and the atmosphere felt different somehow. People were checking their phones more than usual, and conversations kept getting interrupted by text messages and phone calls. I noticed that several of my regular customers seemed distracted, but I chalked it up to pre-holiday stress and the usual end-of-year business pressures. Around 2 in the afternoon, I was wiping down glasses when every phone in the place started screaming at once. Emergency alerts, the kind that make your phone sound like an air raid siren, went off simultaneously across the entire bar. For a moment, everyone just stared at their devices, reading the same message over and over. A massive asteroid had impacted in the North Atlantic Ocean approximately 30 minutes earlier. All coastal areas were advised to prepare for potential tsunami conditions. The reaction was immediate and divided. Half the people in the bar started laughing, making jokes about how the government was always overreacting to everything. The other half went dead silent, staring at their phones like they were looking at their own death certificates. I remember thinking that this was just another false alarm, another case of the media blowing something out of proportion to get ratings. But then the phone started ringing. Not the emergency alerts, but personal calls. People were getting contacted by family members, friends, employers, and government agencies. The dock workers got calls telling them to report to emergency stations. Immediately, the city council members were being summoned to emergency meetings. Even some of the criminals were getting calls from their organizations, telling them to secure their operations and prepare for potential disruption. I kept the bar open because I didn't know what else to do. In my experience, people needed drinks. More during a crisis, not less. But the atmosphere had changed completely. The laughter died down as more information started coming in. The asteroid was bigger than initially reported. The impact had sent massive amounts of debris into the atmosphere. Tsunami warnings were being issued for the entire eastern seaboard. By 4 o'clock, the first customers started leaving. Not everyone, but enough to notice. The smart ones, the ones who had survived previous disasters, were heading home to check on their families and secure their properties. The ones who stayed were either too drunk to care or too scared to move. I found myself serving more shots than mixed drinks, and people were drinking faster than usual. The real change started around 6 in the evening when the sun should have been setting. Instead of the usual orange and red sunset we get in New Orleans, the sky turned a deep red color that I had never seen before. It wasn't the red of a sunset, or even the red of a bad storm. It was the color of dried blood, uniform and unnatural, stretching from horizon to horizon. That's when the ash started falling. At first, it looked like snow, which would have been unusual enough in New Orleans. But as it accumulated on the windows and sidewalks, it became clear that this wasn't precipitation. It was debris, fine particles of rock and dust that had been thrown into the atmosphere by the impact. The ash was warm to the touch and left a gritty residue on everything it contacted. I stepped outside for the first time that day, around 7 o'clock, and immediately felt the difference in the air. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees since morning, and the ash was making it difficult to breathe. The French Quarter, usually bustling with tourists and street performers, was eerily quiet. Most of the shops and restaurants had closed early, and the few people on the streets were moving quickly, covering their faces with shirts and scarves. When I returned to the bar, I found that half of my remaining customers had left while I was outside. The ones who stayed were clustered around the old radio I kept behind the bar, listening to emergency broadcasts. The news was getting worse by the hour. The asteroid impact had been larger than initially reported. Multiple countries were reporting atmospheric disturbances. Airlines were grounding flights due to visibility issues and potential engine damage from the ash. I made my first smart decision of the day around 8 o'clock. I started buying extra supplies. Not just alcohol, but food, candles, batteries, and bottled water. I sent Tommy, a kid who ran errands for me, to hit every grocery store and hardware shop within walking distance. I told him to buy whatever he could carry and not to worry about the cost. Something in my gut was telling me that this wasn't going to blow over in a few days. Tommy came back an hour later with disturbing news. The stores were already running low on emergency supplies. Flashlights, batteries, canned food, and bottled water were flying off the shelves. The lines at gas stations were around the block, and several stations had already run out of fuel. People were starting to panic, and the panic was spreading faster than the ash. By 10 o'clock, I was down to my last few customers. The diehards. The ones who had nowhere else to go or nothing else to lose. We listened to the radio together, sharing information and trying to make sense of what was happening. The reports were fragmented and contradictory, but a pattern was emerging. The asteroid impact had thrown so much debris into the atmosphere that it was blocking sunlight across large portions of the planet. Temperatures were dropping rapidly in areas that should have been experiencing normal weather. I closed the bar. At midnight, something I had never done on a weeknight. As I locked the door and headed upstairs to my apartment, I could hear the ash tapping against the windows like fingers drumming on glass. The sound was soft but constant, and it continued throughout the night. I lay in bed listening to that sound and wondering if I was overreacting to what might turn out to be a temporary disruption. The next morning, I woke up to a world that had changed overnight. The ash had accumulated to a depth of several inches on every surface, and the sky was still that unnatural red color. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, putting us in the low 40s, which was unprecedented for New Orleans in December. More importantly, the power was flickering. The electrical grid was struggling to cope with the atmospheric disturbances, and rolling blackouts were being implemented to prevent total system failure. I spent the second day gathering more supplies and checking on my regular customers. Many of them were dealing with their own problems. The dock workers were being told that shipping operations were suspended indefinitely. The city council members were in constant emergency meetings. The criminals were laying low, waiting to see how the situation would develop before making any moves. But it was the ordinary people who were really suffering. Families with children, elderly residents, people who lived paycheck to paycheck, and couldn't afford to stockpile supplies. They were the ones standing in line at the grocery stores, fighting over the last cans of soup and bottles of water. They were the ones calling family members in other states, trying to find out if this was happening everywhere or just in our area. By the third day, it was clear that this was happening everywhere. The radio reports were coming in from cities across the country, all describing the same phenomena. Ash falling from the sky, temperatures dropping, power grids failing, and people starting to panic. The government was telling everyone to stay calm and follow emergency procedures. But the emergency procedures were designed for hurricanes and floods, not for whatever this was. I made my second smart decision on the fourth day. I started hoarding heating fuel. Propane, kerosene, firewood, anything that could generate heat. I had realized that if the power failed completely, heat was going to be the difference between life and death. New Orleans isn't built for cold weather. Our houses don't have proper insulation. Our heating systems are designed for mild winter temperatures, and most people don't own heavy winter clothing. The temperature dropped below freezing on the fifth day. I had lived in New Orleans my entire life, and I had never experienced a hard freeze that lasted more than a few hours. This was different. The temperature hit 30 degrees before dawn and stayed there throughout the day. Pipes started bursting in older buildings, and the ash was turning to slush that refroze into ice as soon as the sun went down. The power grid failed completely on the seventh day. Not just rolling blackouts, but total system failure. The combination of atmospheric disturbances, increased demand for heating, and infrastructure damage from the freezing temperatures had overwhelmed the electrical system. The last radio broadcast I heard before the batteries died was a government official urging people to conserve fuel and share resources with their neighbors. By the 10th day, people were starting to die. Not from violence or accidents, but from exposure. The temperature had dropped to 20 degrees, and most people simply weren't equipped to survive in those conditions. The hospitals were overwhelmed with cases of hypothermia and frostbite. The morgues were filling up with people who had frozen to death in their own homes. I kept my bar close to regular business, but I started letting people come inside too. Warm up. At first, it was just a few of my regular customers, people I knew and trusted. But word spread quickly that the Crossroads was one of the few places in the French Quarter with heat and food. By the 12th day, I had 20 people crowded into my bar, sharing body heat and rationing the last of my supplies. That's when I realized that my grandmother's tunnels weren't just a piece of family history. They were a lifeline. The underground passages stayed at a constant temperature year-round, somewhere in the mid-60s. They were also stocked with supplies that my grandmother had left behind, canned goods and bottled water that had been sitting in storage for decades, but were still perfectly good. I made my third smart decision on the 13th day. I started moving people into the tunnels. Not everyone, just the ones who were most at risk. The elderly, the sick, the families with young children. I figured the tunnels could support maybe a dozen people comfortably, and I was careful to choose people who wouldn't cause problems or attract unwanted attention. But keeping secrets in a crisis is nearly impossible. By the 15th day, word had spread throughout the French Quarter that Lucky Moreau was running some kind of underground shelter. People started showing up at my door, begging for help, offering to pay for space, threatening to break in if I didn't let them inside. Some of them were people I knew, customers, and neighbors who had always been decent to me. Others were strangers, desperate people who had heard rumors and were willing to do anything to get out of the cold. I had to make a choice. I could try to keep the tunnels secret and let people freeze to death on my doorstep, or I could open them up and hope that I could manage whatever problems that would create. I chose to open them up. I told myself that I was being humanitarian, that I was doing what my grandmother would have wanted me to do. But the truth was, I was scared of being alone. I was scared of trying to survive by myself in a world that was falling apart. I started taking people in on the 15th day, but I established rules from the beginning. Everyone had to contribute something, whether it was labor, supplies, or skills. Everyone had to follow my decisions about rationing and work assignments. And everyone had to agree that any disputes would be settled by me, not by violence or majority vote. I was the one who knew the tunnels. I was the one who had the connections to get supplies. And I was the one who would make the decisions that kept everyone alive. Most people agreed to the rules without argument. They were cold, hungry, and scared, and they were grateful for any shelter. But there were a few who made it clear that they saw this as a temporary arrangement, that they expected to have a voice in how things were run once the immediate crisis passed. One of them was Marcus Webb, a former construction foreman who had been out of work since the impact. He was strong, smart, and used to being in charge of large groups of people. He agreed to my rules, but I could tell he was already thinking about how he would run things differently. I should have trusted my instincts about Marcus from the beginning. I had been reading people for 15 years, and everything about him screamed trouble. He was the kind of person who couldn't follow someone else's lead, who always thought he knew better than whoever was in charge. But I needed his skills, and I needed his help managing the growing group of survivors. So I ignored the warning signs and focused on the immediate problems of keeping everyone fed, warm, and alive. By the end of the first 15 days, I had 37 people living in the tunnels beneath the Crossroads. They ranged in age from 6 months to 78 years old, and they came from every walk of life. Some were my regular customers, people I had known for years. Others were complete strangers who had heard about the shelter through word of mouth. A few were people I would never have trusted under normal circumstances, but desperate times had made for strange alliances. The tunnels were crowded, the supplies were running low, and the temperature outside was still dropping. But we were alive, and that was more than a lot of people could say. I had managed to create a functioning community in the middle of a disaster, and I was starting to think that maybe we could ride this out until the government got things back under control. I was wrong about a lot of things in those first 15 days, but I was most wrong about thinking that the cold was our biggest enemy. The real enemy was already inside the tunnels with us, and he was just waiting for the right moment to make his move. The first group that knocked on my hidden entrance on the 16th day was a family of 4 from the Marigny district. The father, Robert Chun, was a mechanic who had worked on my car a few times. His wife Maria was a schoolteacher, and they had 2 kids, ages 8 and 12. They had been living in their car for 3 days after their apartment building lost heat, and Maria was showing early signs of hypothermia. I let them in without hesitation, but I made sure they understood the rules before I showed them to the tunnels. Robert turned out to be exactly the kind of person I needed in the group. He was practical, skilled with his hands, and he understood that survival required cooperation rather than competition. He immediately started helping me organize the living spaces and figure out how to make the tunnels more comfortable for families. His wife Maria took charge of the children, both her own and the few others who had already joined us. She set up a makeshift school in one of the larger chambers, keeping the kids occupied and maintaining some sense of normalcy in an increasingly abnormal situation. The second group arrived that same afternoon. 3 college students from Tulane who had been stranded when the university closed and sent everyone home. They were young, healthy, and eager to help with whatever needed to be done. Sarah Martinez was a nursing student who immediately became invaluable when people started getting sick from the stress and poor living conditions. Tommy Rodriguez was studying engineering, and he helped me figure out how to improve ventilation and lighting in the tunnels. The third student, Jennifer Walsh, was majoring in psychology, and she started helping people deal with the emotional trauma of losing their normal lives. But it was the third group that arrived on the 17th day that changed everything. Marcus Webb showed up with 5 other men, all of them construction workers who had been laid off when the building projects around the city shut down. Were big, strong, and used to physical labor, which made them valuable for the heavy work that needed to be done. But they were also used to working in a hierarchy where the strongest and most aggressive person was in charge, and Marcus clearly saw himself as that person. Marcus was about 40 years old, maybe 6 feet tall, and built like someone who had spent his entire adult life doing manual labor. He had been a foreman on several major construction projects in the city, and he was used to managing crews of 20 or 30 men. He had a natural authority that people responded to, and he knew how to get things done quickly and efficiently. Under normal circumstances, he would have been the kind of person I would have wanted as a customer at the crossroads. But these weren't normal circumstances, and I could tell from the moment he walked into the tunnels that he saw this as a temporary arrangement. I explained the rules to Marcus and his crew the same way I had explained them to everyone else. Everyone contributes according to their abilities. Everyone follows the rationing system, and all disputes get settled by me. Marcus nodded and agreed to everything, but I could see in his eyes that he was already calculating how things would work differently once he was in charge. He kept asking questions about the layout of the tunnels, how many people we could realistically support, and what our long-term plans were for getting supplies. The problem with Marcus wasn't that he was wrong about most things. He was actually right about a lot of the issues he raised. The tunnels were getting crowded, and we needed a better system for managing waste and maintaining sanitation. Our food supplies were running low, and we needed to establish reliable sources of fresh provisions. The work assignments were inefficient, and we could get more done if we organized people into teams with clear leadership structures. But Marcus's solutions to these problems always involved giving him more authority and reducing mine. He suggested that we needed multiple leaders for different areas of responsibility, with him in charge of security and work assignments. He proposed changing the rationing system to give larger portions to people who did more physical labor. He wanted to recruit more survivors, but only ones who met his standards for physical fitness and useful skills. I listened to Marcus's suggestions because some of them made sense, but I also watched how he interacted with the other survivors. He was building alliances, particularly with the younger men, who were impressed by his confidence and experience. He would hold informal meetings in the evenings, supposedly to discuss work assignments for the next day, but I could tell he was really building a power base. He never directly challenged my authority, but he was laying the groundwork for a challenge that would come later. The group kept growing throughout the third week. Word had spread through the French Quarter that there was a safe place to stay, and people were finding their way to the hidden entrance behind the coffee shop. Some days we would get 2 or 3 new arrivals, other days we would get none, but the trend was always upward. By the 21st day, we had 53 people living in the tunnels, and I was starting to worry that we were reaching the limits of what the space could support. Each new arrival brought their own skills and their own problems. We got a retired nurse named Dorothy Williams, who helped Sarah Martinez set up a proper medical station in one of the smaller chambers. We got a former chef named Antoine Dubois, who took over cooking duties, and somehow managed to make our canned goods and dried supplies taste like actual meals. We got a mechanic named Luis Hernandez, who figured out how to jury-rig a generator system using car batteries and solar panels we scavenged from abandoned buildings. But we also got people who were harder to integrate into the group. There was a man named Frank Morrison who had been living on the streets before the disaster and struggled with alcohol addiction. He was harmless when sober, but he became belligerent and disruptive when he managed to get his hands on drinking alcohol. There was a woman named Patricia Stone who had lost her husband in the first week of the crisis and was dealing with severe depression. She needed constant attention and support, which strained our limited resources. The biggest challenge was a teenager named Kevin Walsh, who had been separated from his family during the evacuation of the lower 9th Ward. He was angry, scared, and convinced that his parents were dead. He got into fights with other survivors, refused to follow work assignments, and kept talking about leaving the tunnels to search for his family. I knew that if he left, he would probably die within a day or two, but I also knew that forcing him to stay would create problems with the other survivors. I dealt with these problems the same way I had dealt with difficult customers at the crossroads. I listened to what people were really saying, figured out what they actually needed, and tried to find solutions that worked for everyone. Frank Morrison needed structure and purpose, so I put him in charge of maintaining our inventory of supplies. Patricia Stone needed to feel useful, so I had her help Maria Chun with the children. Kevin Walsh needed to feel like he was doing something to find his family, so I put him on the teams that went to the surface to look for supplies and information. Most of the time, this approach worked. People appreciated being heard, and they were willing to compromise when they felt like their concerns were being taken seriously. But Marcus was different. He didn't want to be heard or understood. He wanted to be in charge, and he was getting impatient with my leadership style. He started making comments about how we needed to be more decisive, more aggressive, more willing to make the hard choices that would ensure our survival. The first major test of my leadership came on the 23rd day, when we discovered that someone had been taking extra food from our storage area. Our rationing system was based on strict portions calculated to make our supplies last as long as possible, and any deviation from the system threatened everyone's survival. I called a meeting of all the adults in the group and explained the situation. I told them that whoever was taking the extra food needed to admit it and return what they had taken, and that we would work together to address whatever need had motivated the theft. Marcus immediately suggested that we needed to search everyone's personal belongings and punish whoever was responsible. He said that theft was a serious crime that threatened the survival of the entire group, and that we needed to make an example of the person who was putting everyone else at risk. Several of the other survivors agreed with him, particularly the ones who had been following his lead in other matters. I disagreed with Marcus's approach for several reasons. First, searching everyone's belongings would create an atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust that would be harder to repair than the damage caused by the theft. Second, punishing someone harshly for what might have been a desperate act would set a precedent that could lead to increasingly severe and arbitrary justice. Third, I suspected that the person taking the food was probably someone who had a legitimate need that wasn't being met by our current system. I was right about the third point. After some gentle questioning, I discovered that person taking the extra food was Dorothy Williams, the retired nurse who had been helping with medical care. She had been giving extra portions to Patricia Stone, who was barely eating anything due to her depression, and to Kevin Walsh, who was burning extra calories because of his size and age. Dorothy had been taking the food from her own portions initially, but when she started getting weak from hunger, she had started taking small amounts from the common supplies. My solution was to adjust our rationing system to account for people who had higher caloric needs or medical issues that affected their appetite. We created a medical exemption process that allowed Dorothy and Sarah Martinez to recommend additional food for people who needed it, and we established a system for people to voluntarily donate portions of their own food to others who needed it more. Marcus was not happy with this solution. He said that we were setting a dangerous precedent by rewarding theft, and that we were creating a system that could be easily abused by people who wanted extra food for themselves. He argued that we needed clear rules with clear consequences, and that making exceptions would eventually lead to the collapse of our entire social structure. I understood Marcus's concerns, but I also understood that rigid rules, without room for individual circumstances, would create different problems. People would start hoarding food secretly, or they would lie about their needs, or they would form factions based on who was getting what. The goal wasn't to create a perfect system, but to create a system that people could live with, and that would keep everyone alive until the crisis passed. The food theft incident was resolved without anyone being punished, but it created a clear division in the group between people who supported my approach and people who thought Marcus was right. The division wasn't absolute, and most people were somewhere in the middle, but it was noticeable. People started choosing sides in other disputes, and conversations became more political and less focused on practical solutions. The situation got worse on the 26th day when we had our first serious medical emergency. One of the younger children, a 6-year-old boy named Michael Chun, developed a high fever and started having difficulty breathing. Sarah Martinez diagnosed him with pneumonia, which was a serious condition under normal circumstances and potentially fatal in our current situation. We had some basic medical supplies, but nothing like the antibiotics and hospital care that Michael needed. I made the decision to organize an expedition to the surface to find medical supplies. It was dangerous because the temperature outside was still below freezing, and there were reports of violence breaking out in other parts of the city. But Michael was going to die without treatment, and I wasn't willing to let that happen if there was any way to prevent it. Marcus volunteered to lead the expedition, and I initially agreed because he had experience organizing work crews, and he was physically capable of handling whatever dangers we might encounter. But as we planned the mission, it became clear that Marcus had different ideas about what we should be doing on the surface. He wanted to explore the other buildings in the French Quarter, map out potential resources, and make contact with other survivor groups. I wanted to focus specifically on finding medical supplies and getting back to the tunnels as quickly as possible. The disagreement came to a head when Marcus suggested that we should consider relocating the entire group to a different location. He had heard rumors about a large survivor community that had taken over one of the hotels in the central business district, and he thought we should investigate the possibility of joining them. He argued that our current location was too small, too hidden, and too dependent on my personal knowledge of the tunnel system. I rejected Marcus's suggestion immediately. The tunnels were secure, defensible, and equipped with supplies that we knew we could access. Moving 53 people through the frozen streets of New Orleans to join a group of strangers was incredibly risky, and there was no guarantee that the other community would welcome us or that their situation was actually better than ours. More importantly, I suspected that Marcus was more interested in joining a group where he could quickly rise to a leadership position than he was in doing what was best for our current community. The medical expedition went ahead with Marcus as the leader, but I made sure that Sarah Martinez and Tommy Rodriguez were part of the team. I wanted people I trusted to be involved in any decisions that were made on the surface, and I wanted independent reports about what they found. The expedition left early in the morning on the 27th day, and I spent the entire day worrying about what they would encounter and whether they would make it back safely. They returned that evening with good news and bad news. The good news was that they had found a pharmacy that still had some medical supplies, including antibiotics that could treat Michael's pneumonia. The bad news was that they had encountered another group of survivors who were operating more like a gang than a community. This group had claimed territory in several blocks around the pharmacy, and they had demanded payment for allowing our people to take supplies from their area. Marcus had negotiated a deal with the other group, trading some of our food supplies for the medical supplies and safe passage through their territory. The deal was reasonable under the circumstances, but it established a precedent that troubled me. We were now in debt to a group of people who might demand more payment in the future, and we had revealed the existence and location of our community to potential enemies. Sarah Martinez confirmed that the other group was heavily armed and clearly organized for conflict rather than cooperation. She said that their leader, a man named Rick Castellanos, had asked detailed questions about our community and had seemed particularly interested in hearing about our tunnel system. Tommy Rodriguez reported that the other group had been systematically looting every building in their territory and that they had a large stockpile of weapons and supplies. The medical supplies worked, and Michael Chun's condition improved dramatically over the next few days. But the expedition had created new problems that would affect our community for weeks to come. We now knew that there were other groups operating in the city, and not all of them were friendly. We had established a relationship with one of these groups, but it was a relationship based on weakness rather than strength. Most importantly, we had revealed information about ourselves that could be used against us if the situation deteriorated. Marcus used the success of the medical expedition to argue for more aggressive exploration of the surface world. He said that we needed to establish relationships with other survivor groups, map out the resources that were available in the city, and position ourselves to take advantage of opportunities as they arose. He proposed regular expeditions to gather intelligence and supplies, and he suggested that we should start recruiting new members more actively. I was more cautious about surface operations, but I had to admit that Marcus had a point about the need to gather information. We were operating blindly, making decisions based on incomplete information and outdated assumptions. We needed to know what was happening in the rest of the city, what other groups were doing, and what resources were available. But I wanted to approach these activities carefully, with an emphasis on stealth and security rather than contact and negotiation. The tension between Marcus and me was becoming more obvious to the other survivors, and people were starting to choose sides more openly. The division wasn't just about leadership styles or tactical decisions. It was about fundamental questions of how we should relate to the outside world, how we should make decisions as a group, and what kind of community we wanted to be. By the 30th day, I had managed to keep everyone alive and relatively healthy. But I had also created a situation that was inherently unstable. The group was too large to be managed informally, but not large enough to support formal democratic institutions. We had enough supplies to survive for a while, but not enough to feel secure about the future. We had established our community successfully, but we had also attracted attention from people who might not have our best interests at heart. I should have seen what was coming. Marcus was asking too many questions about the tunnel system, spending too much time with the newer arrivals, and making too many suggestions about how things should be run differently. He was building a coalition of people who were grateful for the safety and security of the tunnels, but who thought that I was too cautious, too democratic, and too willing to accommodate people who weren't pulling their weight. The signs were all there, but I was too focused on the immediate problems of keeping everyone fed, warm, and healthy to pay attention to the long-term political dynamics that were developing. I thought that success would breed more success, that proving I could keep people alive would solidify my leadership position. But I was wrong about that, just like I had been wrong about thinking that the cold was our biggest enemy. The real test was coming, and it would determine not just who was in charge, but what kind of people we would become in this new world we were trying to survive. The decision to make another surface expedition came on the 31st day when our food supplies dropped to critical levels. Despite our careful rationing, feeding 53 people required more resources than we had initially calculated. The canned goods and dried supplies I had stockpiled were running out faster than expected, and we needed to find fresh sources of food where people started getting seriously malnourished. I knew that going to the surface was dangerous, but staying in the tunnels and slowly starving was more dangerous. The temperature outside had stabilized at around 10 degrees below zero, which was survivable for short periods with proper clothing and equipment. More importantly, most of the initial chaos and violence that had erupted during the first weeks of the crisis had died down. The people who were going to survive had found places to shelter, and the people who weren't had already died. Marcus immediately volunteered to lead the expedition, and this time I decided to go with him. I had been managing the tunnels for over 2 weeks without seeing the surface world, and I needed to understand what we were dealing with for myself. I also wanted to observe Marcus in action and get a better sense of his judgment and priorities. Something about his reports from the medical expedition had bothered me, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. We organized a team of 8 people for the supply run. Marcus and I would lead, with Sarah Martinez coming along to identify any medical supplies we might find. Tommy Rodriguez joined us because of his technical skills and his ability to spot useful equipment. We also brought Luis Hernandez, the mechanic, Antoine Dubois, the chef, and 2 of Marcus's construction crew, men named Pete Russo and Carl Johnson. The plan was to hit 3 different locations during a single day-long expedition. First, we would visit a large grocery store in the Marigny district that Marcus had identified during his previous surface trips. Second, we would check out a restaurant supply warehouse near the port that Antoine knew about from his previous work in the food service industry. Finally, we would stop at a hardware store to look for tools and materials that could improve our living conditions in the tunnels. I equipped everyone with improvised cold weather gear made from multiple layers of clothing, blankets, and whatever waterproof materials we could find. We carried backpacks, shopping bags, and a small wagon that Louis had constructed from salvaged parts. We also brought weapons, mostly kitchen knives and tools, because Marcus insisted that we needed to be prepared to defend ourselves and our supplies. Leaving the tunnels that morning was like stepping into an alien world. The New Orleans I had known my entire life was gone, replaced by a frozen wasteland that looked like something from a disaster movie. The ash had mixed with ice and snow to create a gray slush that covered everything in a thick, dirty layer. The familiar sounds of the city, the traffic and music and conversation that had provided a constant background soundtrack to my life, had been replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the wind and the occasional sound of something collapsing under the weight of the ice. The French Quarter, which should have been bustling with tourists and street performers, was completely deserted. Most of the buildings showed signs of damage from the freezing temperatures. Windows had cracked from the thermal stress, pipes had burst and created ice sculptures where water had leaked and frozen, and many of the historic wrought iron balconies had collapsed under the weight of accumulated ice and debris. But it was the absence of people that was most disturbing. New Orleans is a city that lives on the streets, where people gather on porches and sidewalks and in parks to socialize and conduct business. Seeing those same streets completely empty, with no signs of human activity except for the occasional footprint in the slush, was more unsettling than any amount of physical damage to the buildings. We made our way through the empty streets toward the Marigny district, moving carefully to avoid patches of ice and debris that could cause injuries. The grocery store that Marcus had identified was a large chain supermarket that had been closed since the second week of the crisis. The front windows had been smashed, and it was clear that the store had been looted multiple times by different groups of survivors. But Marcus had done his reconnaissance well. Most of the looters had focused on the obvious items like bread, milk, and canned goods from the main aisles. They had missed the storage areas, the employee break rooms, and the less obvious sources of food like the bakery supplies and restaurant-grade ingredients. We spent 2 hours systematically going through the entire building, collecting anything that was edible, useful, or tradable. The haul was better than I had expected. We found large containers of flour, sugar, and other baking supplies that would allow Antoine to stretch our food supplies by making bread and other baked goods. We found cases of canned vegetables and soups that had been overlooked because they were stored in the back rooms. We even found a few cases of bottled water and some basic medical supplies that had been left behind in the pharmacy section. But we also found evidence that we weren't the only ones who knew about this location. There were fresh footprints in the dust, recent tool marks where someone had pried open locked storage areas, and signs that someone had been camping in the manager's office. Marcus examined the evidence carefully and concluded that another group had been using the store as a regular supply source, probably visiting every few days to collect whatever new items they could find. This discovery changed the dynamic of our expedition. We were no longer just scavenging from abandoned resources. We were potentially taking supplies that another group considered to be their territory. Marcus suggested that we should leave some kind of message for the other group, offering to trade or negotiate for shared access to the store. I disagreed, arguing that any contact with unknown groups should be carefully planned rather than improvised through messages left in abandoned buildings. The disagreement revealed a fundamental difference in our approaches to dealing with other survivors. Marcus believed that we needed to establish relationships and negotiate arrangements with other groups as quickly as possible. He argued that isolation was a temporary strategy that would eventually leave us vulnerable and cut off from important resources and information. I believe that contact with other groups should be approached cautiously, only after we had gathered enough intelligence to understand their capabilities and intentions. We moved on to the restaurant supply warehouse without resolving the disagreement, but I could tell that Marcus was frustrated with what he saw as my excessive caution. The warehouse was located in an industrial area near the port, and the journey there took us through parts of the city that had been more severely damaged than the French Quarter. Many of the buildings had suffered structural damage from the freezing and thawing cycles, and several had collapsed completely. The warehouse itself had been broken into, but not as thoroughly as the grocery store. The industrial-sized containers and restaurant equipment had been too large and specialized for most looters to bother with. We found enormous bags of rice and beans, cases of canned tomatoes and other vegetables, and large containers of cooking oil and spices. We also found some valuable non-food items like propane tanks, camping stoves, and heavy-duty cooking equipment that could improve our food preparation capabilities. But it was what we found in the warehouse office that really changed the nature of our expedition. Someone had been using the building as a headquarters, and they had left behind maps, supply lists, and other documents that provided detailed information about survivor activities throughout the city. The map showed the territories claimed by different groups, the locations of supply caches and safe houses, and the routes that were considered safe for travel. According to the documents, there were at least 6 major survivor groups operating in different parts of New Orleans, each controlling territory that ranged from a few blocks to several square miles. The group that we had encountered during the medical expedition, led by Rick Castellanos, controlled a significant portion of the central business district and had been expanding their territory aggressively. There were also groups operating in the Garden District, Algiers, the Bywater, and the area around the airport. The documents also contained detailed information about our own community. Someone had been watching the tunnels, noting the number of people who lived there, the times when expeditions left and returned, and the general layout of our security arrangements. The information wasn't complete or entirely accurate, but it was detailed enough to suggest that we had been under surveillance for at least a week. Marcus studied the documents carefully while the rest of us continued loading supplies. When he finished reading, he called me aside for a private conversation. He said that the situation was more serious than we had realized, and that we needed to make some immediate changes to our security and operational procedures. He argued that our current approach of hiding in the tunnels and avoiding contact with other groups was no longer sustainable. I agreed that the discovery of the surveillance was concerning, but I disagreed with Marcus's conclusions about what we should do in response. He wanted to make contact with the other groups immediately, either to negotiate alliances or to establish clear boundaries and rules of engagement. I wanted to improve our security and gather more intelligence before making any decisions about external relationships. The disagreement escalated into our first open argument. Marcus accused me of being too passive and reactive, of waiting for problems to develop instead of taking proactive steps to prevent them. He said that my leadership style might have worked for running a bar, but that it was inadequate for managing a community in a survival situation. I accused him of being too aggressive and impulsive, of wanting to rush into dangerous situations without adequate preparation or consideration of the consequences. The argument was overheard by the other members of our expedition, and I could see that it made them uncomfortable. Up until that point, Marcus and I had disagreed about tactics and priorities, but we had always presented a united front to the rest of the community. Having our leadership dispute become public changed the dynamic within our group and within the larger community that was waiting for us back in the tunnels. We finished loading supplies from the warehouse in tense silence and moved on to the RRDWARE store. The store had been thoroughly looted, but we managed to find some useful items like rope, tarps, and basic tools. We also found a cache of batteries and flashlights that had been hidden behind a false wall, probably by the store employees before they abandoned the building. The return journey to the tunnels was more dangerous than the outbound trip had been. The temperature had dropped as the day progressed, and ice was forming on surfaces that had been merely wet during the morning. More importantly, we encountered signs of other people moving through the area. We saw fresh footprints, heard voices in the distance, and twice had to take cover to avoid being seen by groups of people who were moving through the streets with obvious hostile intent. One of these encounters was particularly unsettling. We were crossing Canal Street when we heard gunshots from several blocks away, followed by shouting and the sound of people running. We took cover in an abandoned storefront and waited for almost an hour before the area became quiet again. During that time, we could hear vehicles moving through the streets, which was unusual because most cars had been abandoned when the gas stations ran out of fuel. When we finally made it back to the tunnels, I called a meeting of all the adults in the community to discuss what we had learned during the expedition. I reported on the supplies we had gathered, the evidence of other survivor groups, and the discovery that we had been under surveillance. I tried to present the information objectively, without revealing the disagreements that Marcus and I had had about how to respond to these developments. But Marcus had different ideas about how the meeting should go. He used the opportunity to present his own analysis of the situation and his recommendations for changes to our security and operational procedures. He argued that we needed to establish contact with other groups immediately, that we needed to organize better defenses for the tunnels, and that we needed to develop a more aggressive approach to gathering supplies and information. Marcus's presentation was well organized and persuasive, and it addressed concerns that many of the survivors had been developing about our long-term security and sustainability. Several people asked questions that clearly supported his analysis, and others made comments that suggested they thought his recommendations were reasonable and necessary. I found myself in the awkward position of having to argue against proposals that weren't necessarily wrong, but that I thought were premature and potentially dangerous. I tried to explain that gathering more information before making contact with other groups was a safer approach, but my arguments sounded defensive and overly cautious compared to Marcus's confident assertions about what needed to be done. The meeting ended without any formal decisions being made, but the political dynamics within the community had clearly shifted. Marcus had established himself as an alternative source of leadership and direction, and several of the survivors were openly supporting his approach over mine. The unity that had characterized our group during the first month was breaking down, and I could see that we were heading toward a more serious confrontation about the future direction of our community. Over the next few days, the effects of the expedition and the meeting became more apparent. People started forming informal groups based on their support for different approaches to our survival strategy. Marcus held evening discussions with his supporters, supposedly to plan work assignments and security procedures, but really to build support for his vision of how the community should be organized. I tried to maintain the collaborative decision-making process that had worked during our first month, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to get consensus on important issues. People who supported Marcus's approach would question my decisions and propose alternatives that aligned with his recommendations. People who supported my approach would become defensive and argumentative when Marcus's supporters criticized our current procedures. The most serious problem was that these political divisions were affecting our operational effectiveness. Work assignments became sources of conflict when people disagreed about priorities and methods. Resource allocation decisions were questioned and debated instead of being accepted and implemented. Even basic maintenance tasks became politicized when people saw them as tests of loyalty to different leadership factions. I realized that I had made a serious mistake by allowing the leadership dispute to become public and by not addressing Marcus's challenge to my authority more directly. In trying to maintain unity and avoid conflict, I had actually created a situation where conflict was inevitable and unity was impossible. The community was going to have to choose between different approaches to survival, and that choice was going to determine not just who was in charge, but what kind of people we were going to become. The signs were all there, but I was still hoping that we could work through our differences without a serious confrontation. I thought that success in keeping everyone alive and relatively comfortable would eventually resolve the political tensions and restore unity to the group. But I was wrong about that, just like I had been wrong about so many other things during those first weeks of the crisis. The real test was coming, and it was going to be about much more than just leadership styles and tactical disagreements. It was going to be about fundamental questions of how human beings should treat each other when civilization collapses and survival becomes the only priority that matters. The confrontation I had been dreading finally came on the 46th day, but it didn't happen the way I expected. I thought Marcus would challenge me directly, maybe call for some kind of vote or demand a public debate about our leadership structure. Instead, he did something much more effective and much more devastating. He simply started acting like he was already in charge. It began with the morning work assignments. For the past month, I had been organizing the daily tasks and coordinating with different people about their responsibilities. But on the 46th day, Marcus gathered his supporters before I was even awake and assigned them to various tasks without consulting me. When I asked him about it, he said he was just trying to be more efficient and that he thought I had too much on my plate to handle every detail of community management. The excuse was reasonable, but the message was clear. Marcus was demonstrating that he could organize and lead people just as effectively as I could, and that the community didn't really need to make decisions about day-to-day operations. Several of the survivors who had been neutral in our previous disagreements started looking to Marcus for direction instead of waiting for me to give instructions. Marcus's approach was subtle but systematic. He didn't openly challenge my authority or criticize my decisions in front of the group. Instead, he simply offered alternatives that seemed more organized, more efficient, and more decisive. When I suggested that we needed to ration our medical supplies more carefully, Marcus proposed a detailed inventory system that would track every item and establish clear protocols for distribution. When I said we should be cautious about future surface expeditions, Marcus presented a comprehensive security plan that would allow us to gather supplies more safely and effectively. The problem was that Marcus's suggestions were often better than mine. He had experience managing large groups of people, and he understood systems and procedures in ways that I didn't. His background in construction had taught him how to organize complex projects, coordinate multiple teams, and solve logistical problems efficiently. My background in running a bar had taught me how to read people and manage interpersonal relationships, but it hadn't prepared me for the administrative challenges of managing a community of 53 people. But Marcus's real advantage wasn't his organizational skills. It was his philosophy about survival and leadership. He believed that communities needed clear hierarchies, strict rules, and strong leaders who were willing to make difficult decisions quickly. He argued that democratic decision-making and consensus building were luxuries that we couldn't afford in a survival situation. According to Marcus, the people who were strongest, smartest, and most capable should be in charge, and everyone else should follow their lead without question. This philosophy appealed to a lot of people in our community, especially the ones who were scared and overwhelmed by the high responsibility of making decisions about their own survival. Marcus offered them certainty instead of uncertainty, clear direction instead of collaborative discussion, and the promise that someone competent was in charge and would take care of everything. I understood the appeal of Marcus's approach, but I also understood its dangers. Strong leadership can become authoritarian leadership very quickly, especially when people are scared and desperate. Clear rules can become arbitrary rules when they're made by people who don't have to live by them. And hierarchies based on strength and capability can easily become hierarchies based on violence and intimidation. The first real test of these competing philosophies came when we discovered that our food supplies were running out faster than expected. Despite the successful supply expedition and our careful rationing system, we were facing the possibility of serious hunger within a week or two. The problem was that some people in the community were burning more calories than others because of their work assignments, their age, or their physical condition, but everyone was receiving the same basic rations. I proposed adjusting our rationing system to account for individual needs, similar to what we had done with the medical exemptions. People who were doing heavy physical labor would get slightly larger portions, while people who were sedentary would get slightly smaller portions. Children and pregnant women would get additional supplements, while healthy adults would reduce their consumption temporarily. The goal was to maintain everyone's health and energy while making our supplies last as long as possible. Marcus disagreed with this approach. He argued that adjusting Rations based on individual needs was too complicated and too subjective to implement fairly. He proposed a simpler system based on contribution to the community. People who did more work, provided more valuable skills, or took more risks for the group would get larger rations. People who contributed less would get smaller rations. The system would be objective, efficient, and would incentivize people to work harder and contribute more to the community's survival. The debate over rationing became a proxy for the larger debate about leadership and community values. My supporters argued that everyone deserved equal treatment regardless of their capabilities, and that our job was to take care of each other rather than to compete for resources. Marcus's supporters argued that survival required making hard choices, and that people who contributed more to the community's survival deserved better treatment than people who contributed less. The discussion became heated, with people on both sides making increasingly emotional arguments about fairness, responsibility, and survival. Sarah Martinez pointed out that many of the people who couldn't do heavy physical labor were providing essential services like medical care, child care, and food preparation. Tommy Rodriguez argued that evaluating people's contributions was subjective and could easily become a way for leaders to reward their friends and punish their enemies. But Marcus's supporters were equally passionate about their position. Pete Russo, one of the construction workers, said that he was tired of working harder than other people only to receive the same rations as someone who spent all day sitting around complaining. Carl Johnson argued that the current system was already unfair because it didn't recognize the different sacrifices that people were making for the community. The meeting went on for hours without reaching any resolution. People were clearly divided, and the emotional intensity of the discussion was creating permanent rifts within the community. I could see that we were approaching a point where compromise would be impossible and someone would have to win while someone else lost. That's when Marcus made his first direct challenge to my leadership. He said that the community was spending too much time debating decisions that should be made quickly and implemented immediately. He proposed that we needed a more efficient decision-making process, with a small group of leaders who could make binding decisions without having to get approval from everyone in the community. Marcus suggested that we should choose 5 people to serve as a leadership council, with each person responsible for a different area of community management. He would handle security and work assignments. I could handle supply management and external relations. Sarah Martinez would manage medical care. Antoine Dubois would handle food preparation and rationing, and Robert Chun would manage maintenance and technical issues. The proposal sounded reasonable on the surface, but it was actually a sophisticated power grab. Marcus had structured the council so that he would control the 2 most important areas of community life, work assignments and security. The other members would be responsible for implementing decisions, but Marcus would be responsible for making decisions about who did what and how the community was protected. He would effectively be the leader of the leadership council, which would make him the leader of the community. I rejected Marcus's proposal immediately, but several people in the community thought it made sense. They were tired of the long discussions and endless debates that had characterized our decision-making process over the past few weeks. They wanted someone to take charge and make decisions, even if those decisions weren't perfect, because they believed that any decision was better than no decision. The debate over the Leadership Council became even more intense than the debate over rationing. People started taking sides openly, with Marcus's supporters arguing that we needed strong leadership, and my supporters arguing that we needed democratic decision-making. The discussions continued late into the night, and by the end of the evening, it was clear that the community was split almost evenly between the 2 approaches. Marcus used the deadlock to make his second major move. He announced that he and his supporters were going to start operating according to their own organizational principles, regardless of what the rest of the community decided to do. They would continue to share space and resources with everyone. else, but they would make their own decisions about work assignments, rationing, and security procedures. This was effectively a declaration of independence from my leadership, but it was presented as a reasonable compromise that would allow both factions to coexist peacefully. Marcus said that people could choose which system they wanted to participate in, and that both groups could learn from each other's approaches and eventually develop a unified system that incorporated the best elements of both. But I knew that this arrangement wouldn't last very long. Having two separate leadership structures within the same physical space was a recipe for conflict, especially when resources were limited and decisions had to be made quickly. Sooner or later, the two groups would disagree about something important, and one group would have to give way to the other. The split became official on the 48th day when Marcus moved his supporters to a different section of the tunnel system. He took about 25 people with him, including most of the younger men, several of the families who were worried about security, and a few of the technical specialists who were attracted to his organizational approach. I was left with 28 people, including most of the children, the elderly, the sick, and the people who were philosophically committed to democratic decision-making. Marcus's group also took about half of our supplies, which they claimed was their fair share based on the number of people who were joining them. The division was negotiated rather than imposed, but it left both groups with fewer resources than either needed to survive comfortably. More importantly, it divided our labor force and our expertise in ways that made both groups less effective than the original community had been. I tried to make the best of the situation by reorganizing my group to take advantage of our remaining strengths. We had Sarah Martinez for medical care, Maria Chun for education and child care, Dorothy Williams for additional medical support, and Robert Chun for technical maintenance. We also had most of the people who were experienced with collaborative decision-making and conflict resolution. But we also had serious weaknesses. We had fewer people capable of heavy physical labor, fewer people with technical skills, and fewer people who were experienced with security and defense. Most importantly, we had fewer people who were willing to take risks or make difficult decisions quickly. My group was better at talking through problems, but Marcus's group was better at solving problems. The two groups coexisted uneasily for the next week, sharing common areas and resources but operating according to different rules and priorities. Marcus's group was more efficient and organized, but they were also more rigid and hierarchical. My group was more democratic and inclusive, but we were also slower to make decisions and less effective at implementing them. The tension between the two groups increased gradually as we competed for access to limited resources in space. Marcus's group claimed the larger chambers and the areas closer to the main entrance because they said they needed more room for their security operations. My group was pushed into the smaller, more remote areas of the tunnel system, which made us feel isolated and vulnerable. The first serious conflict came on the 55th day, when both groups organized surface expeditions on the same day. We hadn't coordinated our plans, and both expeditions ended up targeting some of the same supply locations. Marcus's group reached the locations first and claimed everything of value, leaving my group to search through what remained. When my expedition returned with almost nothing, I confronted Marcus about the coordination problem. He said that his group had followed proper security procedures and had simply been more efficient than mine. He suggested that in the future, his group should handle all surface operations because they were better equipped and better organized for dangerous missions. I rejected Marcus's suggestion, but I also realized that the current arrangement was unsustainable. Having two separate groups competing for the same resources within the same limited space was going to lead to increasingly serious conflicts. We needed to either reunify the community under a single leadership structure or separate completely into independent groups. The decision was made for us on the 58th day when we discovered that both groups were being watched by outsiders. Robert Chun found evidence that someone had been entering the tunnels at night, mapping our layout and observing our security procedures. The surveillance was sophisticated and systematic, suggesting that we were being studied by people who were planning some kind of action against us. Marcus immediately called for a joint meeting between both groups to discuss the security threat. He argued that our internal divisions were making us vulnerable to external enemies, and that we needed to reunify the community under strong leadership to defend ourselves effectively. He proposed that I should step down as leader of my group and accept his authority over the entire community, at least until the external threat was resolved. I agreed that the security threat was serious, but I disagreed with Marcus's analysis of what should be done about it. I argued that our division into two groups was actually an advantage, because it made it harder for outsiders to understand our capabilities and organization. I proposed that both groups should coordinate their security efforts without merging their leadership structures. The meeting ended without any agreement, but the external threat had changed the dynamic between the two groups. People were more scared and more willing to consider extreme measures to protect themselves. Marcus's arguments about the need for strong leadership and unified command were more persuasive when people were thinking about defending themselves against unknown enemies. The crisis came to a head on the 62nd day when we discovered that Marcus had been in secret communication with Rick Castellanos, the leader of the hostile group we had encountered during our medical expedition. Marcus had been providing information about our tunnel system and our internal organization in exchange for promises of protection and support. He had convinced himself that aligning with a larger, more powerful group was the best way to ensure our survival. When I confronted Marcus about the communications, he didn't deny them. Instead, he argued that negotiating with external groups was exactly the kind of strategic thinking that we needed to survive in the long term. He said that trying to remain independent and isolated was unrealistic, and that we needed to choose our allies before our enemies chose them for us. But I knew that Rick Castellanos wasn't interested in allies. He was interested in subordinates. Any arrangement with his group would involve our complete submission to his authority and the integration of our resources into his operation. We would lose our independence, our self-determination, and probably our lives if we resisted any of his decisions. The discovery of Marcus's secret negotiations destroyed any remaining trust between our two groups. My supporters were furious that Marcus had betrayed information about our security and organization to potential enemies. Marcus's supporters were defensive about his actions, but some of them were also troubled by the fact that he had made such important decisions without consulting them. The final confrontation came on the 65th day when Rick Castellanos' people arrived at our tunnel entrance demanding to speak with our leadership. Marcus had apparently agreed to a meeting to discuss the terms of our integration into their organization, but he hadn't informed anyone else about the arrangement. I realized that Marcus had been planning this for weeks, using his position within our community to gather intelligence that would be valuable to Rick Castellanos. The secret meetings, the organizational changes, and even the split within our community had all been part of a larger strategy to position himself as the leader of a unified group that would be valuable enough for Rick Castellanos to accept as junior partners rather than simply conquering and absorbing. But Marcus had made a fundamental miscalculation. He had assumed that Rick Castellanos was interested in negotiation and cooperation, when he was really interested in domination and control. The meeting that Marcus had arranged wasn't going to be a negotiation between equals. It was going to be a demand for surrender, with violence as the alternative if we refused to comply. Standing in those tunnels on the 65th day, listening to the voices of armed strangers calling for our leaders to come out and talk, I realized that everything I had built over the past 2 months was about to be destroyed. The community I had tried to create, the people I had tried to protect, and the values I had tried to preserve were all hanging in the balance. But I also realized that I still had a few advantages that Marcus didn't know about, and that Rick Castellanos couldn't have learned from his intelligence gathering. I knew those tunnels better than anyone else alive. I had connections and resources that I hadn't shared with anyone, and I had been preparing for this kind of confrontation since the day we first encountered hostile survivors on the surface. The real test was about to begin, and it would determine not just who survived, but what kind of world we were going to build from the ruins of the old one. The voices at our tunnel entrance belonged to 6 armed men who had positioned themselves at all the known exits from our underground system. Rick Castellanos had done his homework using the intelligence that Marcus had provided to plan a coordinated operation that would prevent anyone from escaping if the negotiations went badly. But what Rick didn't know was that my grandmother had built more exits than Marcus had ever discovered, and that I had been preparing for exactly this kind of situation since the day we first encountered his group. I gathered my core supporters in the deepest part of the tunnel system, while Marcus went to meet with Rick's representatives. Sarah Martinez, Robert Chun, Tommy Rodriguez, and Dorothy Williams formed the nucleus of my emergency response team, along with a few others who had remained loyal throughout the split. We had maybe 15 minutes before Marcus would return with whatever demands Rick Castellanos was making, and I needed to use that time to implement a plan I had been developing for weeks. The plan was based on something my grandmother had told me years ago about surviving in a world where powerful people wanted to control you. She said that the key was to make yourself more valuable as an ally than as a conquest, and more dangerous as an enemy than as a victim. Rick Castellanos saw our community as a resource to be absorbed, but I was going to show him that we were a force to be respected. I started by moving my people through the hidden passages that Marcus didn't know about. My grandmother had built these tunnels with multiple layers of security, including false walls, concealed entrances, and emergency routes that could be used if the main system was compromised. Over the past month, I had been quietly mapping these passages and stockpiling supplies in hidden chambers that could support a small group for several weeks. But evacuation wasn't my primary strategy. Running away would only postpone the confrontation, and Rick Castellanos would eventually find us wherever we tried to hide. Instead, I was going to use the tunnel system as a weapon against him, turning his own tactical advantages into liabilities. The first part of my plan involved using the poisoning knowledge I had acquired during my years as a bartender. People don't realize how much a bartender learns about toxins, both from dealing with customers who try to slip things into drinks, and from understanding how different substances interact with alcohol and medications. I had been quietly preparing certain compounds from cleaning supplies and other materials we had scavenged, creating substances that could incapacitate people without causing permanent harm. I deployed these substances in the ventilation system that connected to the main tunnel areas where Marcus's people were located. The compounds were designed to cause disorientation and nausea rather than serious injury, but they would make it impossible for anyone in those areas to fight effectively or think clearly. My people were positioned in areas with separate ventilation systems, so we would be unaffected by the substances. The second part of my plan involved exploiting Rick Castellanos' assumptions about our capabilities and organization. He expected to be dealing with a divided community led by inexperienced civilians who would be easily intimidated by a show of force. He didn't expect to encounter organized resistance or sophisticated tactical planning. I had been studying the intelligence reports we had found in the warehouse, learning about Rick's organization and their methods of operation. His group relied heavily on intimidation and overwhelming force, but they weren't prepared for asymmetric warfare or prolonged resistance. They expected quick victories through superior firepower and organization, not extended conflicts against opponents who knew the terrain better than they did. Marcus returned from his meeting with a proposal that was exactly what I had expected. Rick Castellanos was willing to accept our community as a subordinate unit within his organization, provided that we agreed to certain conditions. We would relocate to a facility under his direct control. We would contribute all of our supplies and equipment to his common pool, and we would accept work assignments determined by his leadership structure. In exchange, we would receive protection, regular food supplies, and the security that came from being part of a larger, more powerful organization. The proposal was presented as a generous offer, but it was really an ultimatum. Rick's representatives had made it clear that refusal would result in immediate military action against our community. They had the manpower and weapons to overwhelm our defenses, and they were confident that we would see the wisdom of accepting their terms, rather than fighting a battle we couldn't win. Marcus presented the proposal to both groups as if it were a reasonable negotiation rather than a demand for surrender. He argued that joining Rick's organization would solve all of our problems with supplies, security, and long-term sustainability. He said that maintaining our independence was an unrealistic fantasy, and that we needed to accept the reality of our situation and make the best deal we could. But I could see that even some of Marcus's supporters were troubled by the terms of the proposal. Being absorbed into Rick's organization would mean giving up everything we had built and accepting a subordinate role in someone else's vision of how survivors should organize themselves. The people who had followed Marcus because they wanted strong leadership were discovering that there was a difference between strong leadership and authoritarian control. I let Marcus finish his presentation, and then I stood up to address both groups for what I knew would be the last time. I told them that I understood the appeal of Rick's offer, but that I also understood what it really meant. We wouldn't be joining his organization as partners or allies. We would be surrendering our freedom and our self-determination in exchange for the promise of security that could be withdrawn at any time for any reason. I explained that I had been preparing for this confrontation since our first encounter with Rick's people, and that we had options that Marcus hadn't considered. The tunnel system was more extensive and more defensible than anyone outside our community realized. We had supplies and equipment that we could use to resist any attempt to force us out of our home. Most importantly, we had the knowledge and skills to survive independently, without accepting subordination to anyone else. But I also made it clear that I wasn't going to force anyone to fight who didn't want to. Anyone who wanted to accept Rick's offer could leave with Marcus and his supporters. I would provide safe passage for anyone who chose that option, and I wouldn't hold their decision against them. But anyone who wanted to stay and defend our independence would have my full support and the benefit of the preparations I had been making. The community split again, but this time the division was based on a clear choice between surrender and resistance. About half of Marcus's original supporters decided to stay and fight, including several people who had been critical of my leadership but who weren't willing to give up their freedom to Rick Castellanos. About a quarter of my original supporters decided to leave, mostly people who were too scared or too tired to face another prolonged conflict. Marcus was furious when he realized that his carefully planned alliance with Rick Castellanos was falling apart. He had expected that presenting Rick's ultimatum would force me to step down and accept his leadership, unifying the community under his authority and giving him the credibility he needed to negotiate from a position of strength. Instead, he was discovering that many of the people who had followed him were more committed to independence than they were to his leadership. The final confrontation began when Marcus demanded that I honor the agreement he had made with Rick Castellanos. He said that I was endangering everyone's lives by refusing to accept a reasonable offer, and that my stubbornness was going to get people killed unnecessarily. He accused me of being willing to sacrifice other people's safety to protect my own ego and authority. I responded by revealing what I had learned about Marcus's secret communications with Rick Castellanos. I explained how he had been providing intelligence about our defenses and organization, how he had been planning this confrontation for weeks, and how his supposed concern for everyone's safety was really concern for his own position within Rick's organization. The revelation that Marcus had been working with our enemies destroyed his credibility with most of the remaining survivors. Even people who had supported his organizational ideas were horrified to learn that he had been secretly collaborating with people who were planning to attack us. Several of his closest allies immediately switched sides, and others simply walked away from the conflict entirely. But Marcus wasn't finished. He still had a core group of supporters who were committed to joining Rick's organization, and he still believed that resistance was hopeless and surrender was inevitable. He made one final attempt to take control of the situation by threatening to reveal the locations of our hidden supply caches and emergency exits to Rick's people if I didn't agree to his terms. That's when I implemented the second phase of my plan. The compounds I had introduced into the ventilation system were beginning to take effect, causing disorientation and nausea among the people in the main tunnel areas. Marcus and his remaining supporters found themselves unable to think clearly or coordinate their actions effectively. At the same time, my people emerged from the hidden passages and secured control of the strategic positions throughout the tunnel system. The confrontation that Marcus had expected to be a negotiation between equals became a situation where he was completely outmaneuvered and overpowered. His supporters were incapacitated by the compounds in the air. His intelligence about our defenses was incomplete and outdated, and his ability to threaten us with exposure to Rick's people was neutralized by our control of the communication systems. But I didn't want to simply defeat Marcus. I wanted to resolve the larger conflict with Rick Castellanos in a way that would establish our independence permanently and discourage future attempts at conquest or absorption. That required demonstrating that attacking us would be more costly than leaving us alone, and that we were more valuable as independent allies than as reluctant subordinates. I used Marcus and his supporters as leverage in my negotiations with Rick Castellanos. I sent word that I was willing to discuss terms for a peaceful resolution of the conflict, but that any attempt to take the tunnels by force would result in the loss of the intelligence assets that Marcus represented. I also made it clear that we had capabilities and defenses that Rick hadn't anticipated, and that a military assault would be far more expensive and dangerous than he had calculated. The negotiations took place over several hours, with messages being passed back and forth through intermediaries while both sides maintained their tactical positions. Rick's representatives were clearly frustrated by the unexpected resistance they were encountering, and they were beginning to question whether absorbing our community was worth the cost of a prolonged conflict. I offered Rick a counter-proposal. That would give him most of what he wanted without requiring us to surrender our independence. We would establish a trade relationship that would provide his organization with regular supplies of food, medical equipment, and technical expertise. We would share intelligence about other survivor groups and coordinate our activities to avoid conflicts over territory and resources. We would even provide sanctuary for his people if they needed medical care or temporary shelter. But we would maintain our own leadership structure, our own decision-making processes, and our own control over our territory and resources. We would be allies rather than subordinates, partners rather than vassals. The relationship would be based on mutual benefit rather than domination and control. Rick initially rejected the counter-proposal, demanding that we accept his original terms or face the consequences of military action. But when his representatives attempted to coordinate an assault on the tunnels, they discovered that the situation was more complicated than they had anticipated. Several of his men had been affected by the compounds in the ventilation system. The tunnel entrances they thought they controlled were actually decoys, and their intelligence about our defenses was incomplete and misleading. The turning point came when Rick realized that Marcus had been providing him with false or outdated information about our capabilities. Marcus had been so focused on positioning himself for a leadership role in the merged organization that he had exaggerated his knowledge of our defenses and underestimated our ability to resist. Rick found himself committed to an operation that was more difficult and more dangerous than he had been led to believe. After 12 hours of standoff and failed attempts to penetrate our defenses, Rick Castellanos agreed to accept my counter-proposal. The cost of conquering us had become higher than the value of absorbing us, and the benefits of having us as independent allies were beginning to outweigh the advantages of having us as reluctant subordinates. The agreement we reached established our independence while acknowledging the reality of our situation in a world dominated by larger, more powerful organizations. We would trade with Rick's group and coordinate with them on matters of mutual interest, but we would maintain our own identity and autonomy. The relationship was based on mutual benefit rather than domination, and either side could withdraw from the arrangement if it was no longer serving their interests. Marcus and his remaining supporters were given the choice of staying in our community under the new arrangement, or leaving to join Rick's organization as originally planned. Most of them chose to stay, accepting that their attempt to change our leadership structure had failed, but recognizing that our independence was more valuable than the security that Rick's organization offered. The resolution of the conflict established our community as a recognized independent entity in the new social structure that was emerging from the collapse of the old world. We had demonstrated that we could defend ourselves against larger, more powerful groups, and we had shown that we were more valuable as allies than as conquests. The precedent we set influenced how other survivor communities dealt with similar challenges, and our model of independent cooperation became an alternative to the authoritarian hierarchies that dominated most post-collapse organizations. By the 75th day, we had not only survived the immediate threats to our existence, but we had established ourselves as a stable, independent community with the resources and capabilities to thrive in the new world. Our population had stabilized at around 40 people, our supply systems were sustainable, and our relationships with other survivor groups were based on mutual respect rather than fear or domination. The crisis had tested everything I thought I knew about leadership, community, and survival. I had learned that keeping people alive wasn't just about managing resources and maintaining security. It was about preserving the values and relationships that made survival worthwhile. I had also learned that independence required constant vigilance and the willingness to fight for principles that many people were willing to abandon in exchange for temporary security. Looking back on those first 75 days, I realize that the real victory wasn't defeating Marcus or outmaneuvering Rick Castellanos. The real victory was proving that ordinary people could maintain their humanity and their freedom even in the most desperate circumstances. We had chosen cooperation over domination, democracy over authoritarianism, and independence over security. Those choices had made us stronger rather than weaker, and they had created a community that was worth defending and worth preserving. The ice age that had destroyed the old world was far from over, and we would face many more challenges in the months and years ahead. But we had established the foundation for something better than what we had lost. We had created a community based on the values we wanted to preserve rather than the fears we wanted to escape. On the 90th day, as I looked around at the faces of the people who had chosen to stay and fight for our independence, I realized that we had accomplished something that most people thought was impossible. We had survived not just the physical challenges of the Ice Age, but the moral and social challenges of rebuilding civilization from the ground up. We had proven that the collapse of the old world didn't have to mean the abandonment of everything that had made that world worth living in. The future was still uncertain, and we would face many more tests of our resolve and our principles. But we had learned something important about survival that would serve us well in whatever challenges lay ahead. The strongest communities aren't built on fear and domination. They're built on trust, cooperation, and the shared commitment to Values that are worth preserving, even when preservation requires sacrifice. So that's how I survived the first 90 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. Not just by keeping people alive, but by keeping alive the idea that survival is about more than just staying breathing. It's about preserving the things that make life worth living, even when the world ends and everything you thought you knew turns out to be wrong. The temperature is still dropping, the supplies are still limited, and there are still people moving through the tunnels at night who might not have our best interests at heart. But we're lucky morose people now, and we've learned that luck isn't something that happens to you. It's something you make for yourself through preparation, courage, and the willingness to bet everything on the belief that tomorrow can be better than today.